What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to have a deep dive educational exploration here. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. But if you're new to the podcast or if you're not familiar with the other segments, I have rants where I kind of go and vent or discuss hot topics and call out some things, which I might do a little bit in this episode. But just overall arching theme for that. Then we also have full length interviews. Those are conversation with experts, athletes, coaches, anyone that has their particular zone or how they got into the zone or however they're contributing to the game of baseball itself, right? Then we have mental minutes, quick mental game hacks to help elevate your performance. There's quite a few of those that I've had where it's just kind of more focusing on your overall mindset, your overall outlook and perspective on life and the game itself, right? But those deep dive educational explorations into the small little nitty gritty is what we're going to go over today. But if you have any other topics that you guys want to hear, feel free to put that, and you can text that if you look in the show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, I don't have that on there. That would be on other platforms. But feel free to comment. Let me know what you guys would want to hear more about. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get right into this one on kind of debunking the Handgrip dynamometer myth, which we'll go through a research study recently on this for professional athletes, which I kind of did like. But this right here is a hand dynamometer, for those of you who don't know. Okay, so what they did, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here for whenever we were looking at certain studies, and then I'll go off of where I actually got this from. So bear with me for just one sec. All right. For those of you who are watching online, you can see this. For those of you not, I'm going to read it off to you so that we kind of get a better understanding of everything going on. So the title of it is there a relationship between grip strength and injuries in professional baseball players, right? A lot of people think that as far as it being in regards to UCL, Tommy Johns, right? Things like that. And again, this is kind of debunked a little bit. But you can kind of glance over this, and this is kind of for the general population who can kind of look this up and see things. But for the full study itself, right, I wanted to kind of look at this, and they were basically saying, hey, hockey combine does this to help, kind of look at the overall grip strength, right? And they used 123 pitchers across every Major League Baseball team, right? 53 or a little under 25% had a shoulder or elbow injury. One had greater than one injury over the course of the season. So again, there's injury history to kind of have to deal with there. And there were 39 involving elbow and forearm and 37 for the shoulder. 4 players had both shoulder and elbow. And then of the elbow injuries, 4 involved UCL. Okay. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting to me, right? For all pitchers, the mean grip strength, so the average was 144. So if I squeeze this thing right here and I just let it rip, right? And it said 144, that was the average of everyone's, which isn't bad, but anything less than that is probably not great. So for the dominant arm, their mean was 148 who had injuries. But for the pitchers who didn't, it was actually a little bit less of an average, 146 or 142.6. Kind of threw me for a loop whenever I was reading this, to be honest, right? So it's not necessarily the number of what's going to keep you healthy. And, as they were kind of going through all of this, they were saying, hey, who didn't sustain an injury? They just kind of stayed consistent throughout the season and maybe had a stronger grip strength. And some of them resulted in a more strength in the middle of the season, mainly because I think they were just getting better at actually gripping this thing, right? It's kind of a skill, to be able to squeeze that and know how to do it properly. So there was probably a learning curve at first for them to have that initial gain. And if they maintain that strength over the course of time, then, they were able to have no injuries for that season. Okay. So again, they kind of go into a little bit more, but for the fine print and what they really don't tell you, right, kind of, I mentioned this already. It was the slight increase could have been due to chance, but there's other explanations such as in-season workouts or training, or increased comfort with the grip, right? But again, you're comparing things that aren't necessarily super game-like. And this is where the actual results come into play, where they're saying, hey, there's really no significant difference in the mean grip strength over the course of the season with guys who have injuries or guys who don't. Okay. So, but that's just gripping this thing with all four fingers, right? Kind of like how you grip a bat, but a little bit wider, and then you're pulling that in. So, what Ryan Cronin, where I initially kind of came across this, right? He was essentially saying in this post that he formerly worked with the Angels, did that across all, I think it was probably all minor league and probably some of the major league guys there too. And he said that he loved that they were just over just pro guys because they have this quote unquote dreaded velocity curse. But it's really going into more of the full hand grip that doesn't isolate the FDS flexor digitorum superficialis, right? That's a tongue twister, or the FDP, the flexor digitorum profundus, right? So if we think two fingers, and this is how you're going to grip a baseball, right? That's kind of essentially what he's saying. These are activated differently than when you're gripping one of these, okay? One of these little hand grip dynamometers. So when you have those, they are going to co-contract during the arm path, right? So they're coming through here and they're holding onto the baseball, holding on, and I have a really high velocity too, mind you, right? Through that external rotation into internal as the acceleration phase when the arm's going forward. And there's eccentric force, which attempts to minimize opening the inner elbow space, right? So eccentrically, they're working eccentrically. And one thing that I thought it was really interesting, he found that a lot of guys from returning to TJ, their FDS and FDP strength lost when they did reverse throws. Okay, so think holding on to a baseball versus letting go at a certain period of time and you're throwing it backwards. Again, there's a whole nother rant that I've done on that as far as how butchered those are. Not saying that you shouldn't do them, but it's not training things correctly. And especially if overall arm health is what we're looking at, then that's something that you probably need to keep in mind, especially if you're constantly doing reverse throws and you have forearm issues. That would probably be the first thing I would knock out, to be honest, right? But they're really, what he's saying is at layback, it's not just holding this at 90 degrees, and that's where the study was done, right? They had the elbow down at their side, elbow at 90 degrees, and they gripped it, right? But where he found some of the strength changed when they went to 90-90, or kind of like where you're going to be at a weight-bearing foot plant position. However, right, those are still two not great positions of where this would be happening, right? Because you have that eccentric, like everything's going to be totally different when you're going into layback and into accelerate. And if you notice, if you're watching this, I have a armcare.com, which is what he's a big endorser of. He's part of that, and his course on that was well done as well. So highly recommend you guys checking that out. But what they do is they have those guys get in that 90-90 position and flex this with the two finger or the three fingers. So index, middle, and thumb on how they would normally grip a fastball, right? And then they're testing and comparing that to body weight percentage and getting a score spit out from that, right? So just something to kind of be a little bit more aware of when you're reading research studies. Like obviously has no significant difference, but if it's not comparing things and making it into as game-like as possible, then that's why there's no significant differences that you're finding, right? So I highly recommend you guys, if you're listening to this and you haven't tried out the ArmCare app, definitely do it. Again, shameless plug. There's no necessarily thing that I benefit from that. I'm not necessarily affiliated in any way. But I do have an ebook coming out to kind of expand on that a little bit more. But with those findings and even just kind of reflecting back on my own explorations and trying to find some things out, where I went through all the biomechanics. And as an undergrad, I had 10 guys who were rolling through and doing the study, and they had to warm up and we had to put all the markers on them. But I noticed that it wasn't necessarily finding any significant difference in a lab where it's not looking anything like what it would be like in the game. And I'm like, okay, well, this isn't where I can make a difference, right? If there's no quote unquote significant difference statistically that's being found, but obviously within the game, we know that the game is a game of millimeters and inches, right? Really, really small, minute changes that can make a massive difference, even if it's not statistically significantly different, right? So from there, that's kind of where I shifted to go down more of the strength and conditioning route, and why I was so passionate about that, and also intertwining and making sure that the skill and the strength were actually being able to work together, right? Versus them being two separate silos or two complete different entities. They do complement each other, right? And why whenever I do all the remote training, I love to have the strength and the throwing, or at least know what they're doing if they have a school or whatever program they're a part of, seeing what they're doing and aligning that with their throwing or drills or skill specific work, right? If I'm kind of advising them and making sure that I'm giving them the best plan to execute, right? It only makes sense to be able to have a bird's eye view and see how everything is being done, right? So again, this is just a little deep dive, but to be honest, right? Obviously, if you got anything out of this, armcare.com, or testing something a little bit more game-like or more skill specific versus just a pure strength metric, is going to go a long way, especially whenever it comes to something as finite as UCL strains, tears, from throwing a baseball, right? Now, don't get confused with that as far as for the lower body. I've been exploring some of that a little bit as well. But from what I found, and I would love to hear from you guys as listeners if you know of anything else that you've come across, vertical jumps, different types of those, and broad jumps, bilateral movements, and then I went to single leg. They correlate relatively the same, and also plane specific didn't make much of a difference from a lateral jump to a vertical jump. Which again, I would think, hey, something a little bit more plane specific. If you test that, it's going to be a little bit more correlated. For whatever reason, it's not, right? So I would love to dive a little bit deeper into that myself, but due to some of the resources that I have of, just being a trainer and helping guys out, whatever resources they have, I haven't been able to dive into that as much. But you got to remember that everything affects everything, right? It's never just completely isolation of just the forearm, right? It's the shoulder. How is the scap moving? Okay. How is the T-spine? How's the clavicle actually rotating, right? How's everything else traveling up through that kinetic chain up until a ball release to actually get an answer of what's being done at the joint itself, right? I think we're not quite there yet technology wise, where everything is kind of more off of the pulse, or back in the day it was called modus, with a little sensor. The only way you can really get into it is if you can put a sensor on those actual tendons and ligaments and muscles to see when those stresses are being applied and how to actually train those. And also feel free to check out Flex Pro Grip. I think they're really good at doing that on the fingertips as well. That's also very commonly overlooked as far as training and testing those. So if I were to redo that entire study, I would keep the same group, right? Obviously do it at the beginning of the season, and probably do the Flex Pro Grip comparison and also the armcare.com one, right? See which one, like if there are any differences between the two measurements. Maybe have a couple teams do one or the other, or maybe they do both, right? To keep it kind of consistent, they could do both within that and find out what's actually going on here, what could be an indicator, and find some type of significant difference, right? That's going to be a little bit more specific than just grabbing onto everything with 4 fingers and a thumb versus 3 thumb and 2 index and middle finger, or whatever fingers that you would throw the ball with, right? But that's it for this episode. This is just kind of me going a little bit deep, maybe a little bit of a rant towards the end there, but hope you guys enjoyed this and learned something about it. If you know someone who needs to listen to this, please send it to them and stay in the zone.